In late 1966, Point Pleasant, a blue-collar Ohio River town of about 6,000 people, lived under a pall of Cold War anxiety and economic strain. Strip-lit factories, barroom gossip, and an old river bridge shaped both the physical town and the anxieties that fed every whispered horror. Communication was analog. Local papers like the Point Pleasant Register, AM radio, intermittent regional TV, rotary phones, and police radio. Rumor moved in human chains and printed lines, not viral video. Consumer photography was limited to grainy black and white stills and 8mm home movies. County forensics meant fingerprint cards and handwritten logs, not DNA or digital metadata. Into that low-tech world came a steady drip of uncanny reports from late 1966 into 1967. Sightings of a ragged, winged, red-eyed figure, cars stopping on lonely roads, and a slow conflation with what later became the Silver Bridge catastrophe. To untangle what happened, we'll interrogate physical and institutional records, police incident logs and dispatch tapes where they exist, contemporaneous newspaper clippings and headlines, recorded eyewitness interviews and their later retellings, surviving photographs and audio, and the case files compiled by early investigators such as John Keel and local law enforcement. Our method pairs meticulous timeline reconstruction, cross-referencing timestamps, dispatch entries, and press dates, with rigorous source criticism. We assess memory decay, leading questions, photo provenance and chain of custody, editorial agendas, and the social dynamics that amplify fear. That forensic narrative frame sets the stage for a scene-by-scene retelling, starting with the first late 1966 encounter and moving toward the bridge collapse that fused folklore and fact into a single, ashen omen. In early November 1966, the first reports arrived at the sheriff's office like a slow, infectious drip. One man driving home on a moonlit county road said his headlights cut across a hulking silhouette that unfurled wings and fixed him with twin, searing red points. A woman walking her dog at dusk described a gaunt, taloned shape perched on a power pole that sent a flock of crows scattering. At first, the accounts were logged as isolated oddities in the blotter strange calls from jittery citizens, written in shorthand and stamped with dates. But the details began to converge. Wings called ragged or bat-like, a standing height far above human, eyes repeatedly described as luminous, crimson, or ember bright, a smell witnesses likened to ozone or burned hair. Within days, the trickle became a stream. Teenagers cruising the river road pulled over, engines idling, and trained telescopes and cameras on a dark figure that fled with a flapping, throat-rattling wingbeat. An off-duty dispatcher recalled an out-of-breath woman who swore something jumped on top of her car and left claw gouges in the sheet metal. Grainy photographs and a jittery 8mm clip began circulating. A smeared silhouette under sodium streetlight, an angular limb caught mid-flap. Negatives that showed bright blooms where eyes should be, but no detail beyond terrifying geometry. The Point Pleasant Register ran one such image under a blunt headline, and the next morning radio interviews repeated the same chilling words: red eyes, wings, talons. So private fear took on public shape. Officers revised their entries as calls multiplied. Deputies who had scoffed at first started adding descriptors, timestamps, and later, notes about multiple corroborating witnesses. Neighborhoods that had been worrying about factory layoffs a few weeks earlier now traded frightened watch schedules and drove slowly in pairs after dark. Rumor braided with memory. Later interviews showed details hardened as soon as they were spoken, and neighbors began matching separate encounters into a single monstrous identity. That pattern created a community-wide template for interpretation, assembling disconnected incidents into a coherent, predatory presence, and it primed the town to read a coming catastrophe as an ominous sign. John Keel arrived as a trained provocateur of the uncanny, a seasoned Fortean and ufologist who treated each hushed rumor as a thread in a larger, monstrous tapestry. He interviewed witnesses with clipped, clinical curiosity, and then wove those interviews into a prophetic narrative. Mothman as harbinger, Mothman as signifier of otherworldly intelligence, tied to UFO activity and the shadowy men who hovered at the edges of panic. Keel favored pattern over parsimony. He emphasized coincidences, synchronicities, and nightmares shared across households, and he often framed ambiguous details, red glows, flapping sounds, sudden deadening of radios, as evidence of an intelligent, warning entity. His questions sometimes nudged witnesses toward metaphysical meaning, and by publicizing those interviews, he telescoped private fear into public prophecy. Alongside Keel, early investigators, local reporters, deputy sheriffs, and a handful of civilian researchers gathered the photographic and audio artifacts that became the case's physical bones. Those artifacts repay careful scrutiny. The so-called photos are jagged, overexposed blots with halos that can be mimicked by lens flare and development anomalies. The 8mm clip is a tremulous smear of motion and shadow, a movie of panic more than proof. Audio tapes touted as wing beats or guttural cries often contain low-frequency rumble and radio interference. Spectral analysis can reveal camera motor whine and traffic noise rather than a demonic throat. Witness statements contradict where it matters. Height estimates vary wildly, the number of glowing eyes shifts, and some accounts place the figure at roadside distance, while others insist it perched on wires. Chronologies blur as memories consolidate, and repeated retellings harden descriptive flourishes into fact. Keel and his cohort favored connective tissue, UFO reports from neighboring counties, tales of black-suited emissaries, newspaper clippings echoing each other, in a way that made prophetic reading inevitable. That interpretive choice changed how photos and tapes were weighed, transforming ambiguous artifacts into omen-bearing relics. The result was escalation, an interpretive frame that bent stray data toward catastrophe and primed Point Pleasant to read a later structural failure as fulfillment. The stage is set, and the narrative pressure rises toward a collision between forensic explanation and prophetic meaning. Keel's prophetic scaffolding met sober skepticism. Both skeptics and specialists pushed back with blunt, mundane explanations. Ornithologists pointed to large nocturnal birds and owls, whose wings, eye shine, and sudden silhouettes can look monstrous at road-edge speed. Optics experts showed how headlights, lens flare, and overdevelopment create bloody halos where eyes seem to be. Acousticians demonstrated how car engines, distant trains, and wind through girders produce low-frequency thumps that listeners interpret as wing beats or guttural cries. Psychologists described memory conformity, suggestibility, and rumor cascades, how a single vivid report spawns 100 variants, each retelling sharpening grotesque details until the original ambiguity fossilizes into terror. Hoax potential remained simple and real. Pranksters, staged figures, and miscaptioned photographs could be amplified by hungry newspapers. Once images and adjectives enter the public record, they act like contagion, influencing later witnesses who then retrofit their memories to match the headlines. Those naturalistic counters did not erase the town's growing dread. If anything, they sharpened a divided vision. Some saw misperception and mischief, others a malignant sign. The built environment compounded the split. Engineering analyses carried out after the catastrophe later identified a fracture-critical weakness in the Silver Bridge's eye-bar suspension system. A single cracked eye-bar, corroded and overstressed by increased traffic and winter freeze-thaw cycles, could release a catastrophic chain reaction. Inspectors pointed to material fatigue, stress concentrations, and inadequate redundancy. One brittle link, one silent crack, one invisible surrender. For a community steeped in omen language, that structural vulnerability read like prophecy. The same newspapers that fanned the Mothman flames had run pieces about the bridge's age and shuddering joints. Drivers reported hairline jolts and strange noises on icy nights. Memory, rumor, and tangible engineering risk braided together into a taut cable of expectation. As winter closed, the town's anxiety hardened into an expectant hush that made ordinary creaks sound like premonitions. That charged atmosphere was the final pressure before the bridge itself became the event that would either validate or utterly swallow the myth, and the world leaned in to watch what would break. The Silver Bridge's shuddering rupture on December 15, 1967, an ashen, twilight-hour snap that sent a stream of commuters into icy black water, was the crucible that welded rumor to omen. In an instant, the town's accumulated dread became a headline. 46 dead, cars swallowed by the river, twisted eye bars bending like snapped bones, bodies and severed lives visible in grainy TV frames that played across the nation. Reporters juxtaposed wreckage photos with eyewitness sketches of red eyes and ragged wings, and radio announcers repeated breathless witness phrases until the two images, mangled steel and monstrous silhouette, fused in the public mind. Engineers and federal investigators later traced the mechanical horror to a single, brittle failure, a fractured eye bar in the suspension chain. The bridge was fracture critical with no redundancy. A microscopic fatigue crack, propagated by corrosion, stress concentrations, heavier traffic, and winter cold, grew until the link gave way catastrophically. Metallurgists' fractography and load analysis explained the physics with cold clarity, and bridge designers archived the case as a lesson in redundancy and inspection. Those technical truths, however, could not pry the omen loose. The photograph of a snapped link beside a terrified witness quote had already encoded causality. The collapse read as fulfillment, not accident. For Point Pleasant, the bridge collapse crystallized fear into narrative, anchoring the Mothman as both portent and punctuation. And that fused story carried forward into the town's memory, commerce, and ritual. The Silver Bridge's snapped steel became the seed for a grotesque, enduring mythology that John Keel harvested in his book, turning local trauma into a national parable of omen and dread. Keel's reportage, equal parts forensic notebook and fevered prophecy, gave shape to rumor, and the 2002 Hollywood film amplified the spectral imagery into mainstream ghoulish iconography. Point Pleasant embraced the horror economy. A Mothman museum, annual festivals, souvenir skulls and prints, guided tours that monetize fear and memory, and a steady trickle of tourists who feed a town's post-industrial coffers. That commercialization perpetuates the narrative, creating ritualized retellings that ossify detail into dogma. Psychologically, Mothman endures because humans crave pattern in chaos, especially under cultural anxieties such as Cold War dread and economic precarity, conditions that prime communities to read signs in shadows. Media incentives reward sensational linkage, stitching unrelated events into a tidy moral arc. In the end, the legend survives not because metal failed or because wings stalked the night, but because we prefer ominous stories that give catastrophe a face. The real horror may be our hunger for meaning in the aftermath of ruin.